The history of the city of Belfast is dominated by conflicts of the 20th century. It was the epicentre of a lot of the fighting in the War of Independence and then later the Troubles. But this masks a forgotten chapter in Belfast's history, and that's its connections to the slave trade. And in this video, I'm going to reveal how Belfast had a long history of involvement with the slave trade. Now, to explore this intriguing history, I interviewed Tom Thorpe, a historian and tour guide in Belfast who's an expert on the city's connections to the transatlantic slave trade. We began by talking about Belfast's early history and how it began to profit from the slave trade back in the 17th century.
So Belfast is formed in 1613, and it starts to evolve very slowly, but it starts to have connections with the transatlantic slave trade, really towards the end of the 17th century.
Now, Belfast's involvement in the slave trade came in two ways. So first of all, merchants in Belfast did enslave people in the Americas, but also a lot of merchants in Belfast kind of profited indirectly. So they processed and sold slave-produced goods. So we'll look at both of them. But first, Tom explained how people in Belfast were involved in enslaving people in the Americas.
There are a number of individuals and who are involved, and certainly Waddell Cunningham is one of them, and his plantation called Belfast. I think there's a Dr. Halliday who has a plantation called Hillsborough. I think these are both on Dominica.
Now, we have data from the 1830s which reveals the extent of this involvement and how people in Belfast were involved in enslaving hundreds of people in the Americas.
In terms of Belfast, there are 5 plantations owned by 3 individuals. So essentially, they own probably around 600 slaves altogether, and three individuals in Belfast. That's probably relatively small. By 1830, Belfast would have probably had a population of around 80,000.
Now, alongside those who were involved in directly enslaving people, there was a lot of people in the city of Belfast who profited from the slave trade, as Tom explains now.
But lots of people are sort of benefiting indirectly from the products that come into Belfast to be processed in terms of cotton and things like that.
Now, Belfast's history of involvement in the slave trade actually survives in the landscape of the city today. So there's lots of narrow lanes in Belfast called entries, and one in particular called Sugar House Entry has a connection to the slave trade, as Tom now explains.
So the entries in Belfast are these very small sort of back lanes. And so in Sugar House Entry, you actually had a sugar refinery. You used to process sugar when it came off the ships. And so this is one of the very first sort of connections that Belfast has with the transatlantic slave trade.
While Belfast has this dark history of involvement in slavery, it also has a long radical tradition. It was where republicanism was first established in Ireland, and in the 1790s, many Irish Republicans in Belfast were opposed to slavery. One leading Belfast Republican, a man called Thomas Russell, actually refused to eat sugar because it had been produced by enslaved people in the Americas. Now, if you want me to make a full video on the anti-slavery movement in Belfast, just leave a comment below, and if I get enough feedback, I'll make one of those. If you want to find out more about this forgotten chapter of Belfast's history, I also have a link to a full podcast that myself and Tom made on the topic. You can get that below. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to get the next video when it drops.